In our last video, we discussed using shadow map shadows as a way of adding additional realism to a scene. When you're wanting more of a crisp look to your shadows, or when needing a shaded effect that blurs with the shadow's distance away from the objects casting that shadow, you'll instead want to choose from a couple of alternative shadow types in 3ds Max. We'll look at those other options here. I'll again be using the Controlling Shadows file from the Working Files folder. A harder edge shadow can be achieved by using the Ray Trace shadow type. It's ideal for creating, for an example, the shading that you'd see outside on a bright sunny day. With our lights selected, over in the Modify panel, we can switch over to using the Ray Trace shadow. Now, before we render, let's evaluate the shadow in our colored view. Having last used the Shadow Map shadow type, you can see that we don't have a definitive crisp edge to our shadow. Now that'll all change using Ray Trace. Let's go ahead and render. The shadow now looks like it's been cut out with a knife. Very sharp and very much different than the results we were getting when using Shadow Map shadows. The reason the shadow is so accurate is because, unlike a Shadow Map shadow that uses an actual pixel-based map to create its shading, Ray Trace shadows instead are generated from an actual mathematical formula that creates a more precise way of creating a shadow. In addition to creating a much crisper shadow, Ray Trace shadows also more accurately create the proper shading effect that you see with transparent surfaces. We can easily see that by changing the opacity level on one of the objects in our scene. Let's close the rendered window, then open the material editor by typing M. Using the eyedropper located directly to the left of where a material is named, we'll access the dark purple skin on the outside object. With that now back in the editor, we'll drop down to the extended parameters section and change our transparency falloff to 65% inward. This will serve to make the material 65% more transparent toward its inside than it is toward the out. Let's go ahead and re-render our perspective view. There's the proper shading. We're getting that using the Ray Trace shadow. Why don't we go ahead and quickly compare that to the way a Shadow Map shadow would look. Back in the Modify column, we'll change from Ray Trace shadows to Shadow Map and render again. As you can see, the level of transparency just doesn't show up when using a Shadow Map shadow. Let's go ahead and take that back to Ray Trace and we'll re-render. We can then return to the material editor, taking the transparency falloff back to 0. We'll close the editor, then render again to make sure that we're back to our original skin. Now, when wanting to create the effect of the shadow blurring as its distance away from the object increases, the effect that you see here in a picture that's been provided to us courtesy of 123rf.com, you'll instead opt to use a special type of shadow in Max called an area shadow. Area type shadows are designed to cast a shading effect that feathers out or fuzzes up over distance, something that you more typically see with real-world lighting schemes. Let's go ahead and activate the area shadow. Back in the Shadows category, we'll choose Area Shadows. Once that's in place, let's render our scene again. With the Area Shadow, we now see a slight blurring or falling off effect as the shadow gets farther away from the object casting it. That blurring effect can be further controlled in the Area Shadow section, with the Area Light Dimensions length and width settings, adjusting the overall level of blur as the shadow's distance increases away from the object. Let's see how the blurring on the shadow changes if we take the length to 20 and the width to 20. Up in the anti-aliasing options, both the shadow integrity and shadow quality can be adjusted to control the overall accuracy of the shading effect. Now, both do affect your render times, so make sure to keep that in mind as you're making your adjustments. Let's take the shadow integrity to 5 and we'll take the shadow quality to 10. Once those numbers are in place, we'll render again. So a nice little improvement to the effect. Crisp at the edge where the shadow butts up against the objects, and a smooth, accurate falloff as the shadow's distance away from the objects casting that shadow increases. So that'll give you a little taste of controlling shadows in 3ds Max. Different types, different options. All important in creating a greater sense of realism in your scenes.